So yeah, thank you for coming. I must say I feel giving a talk is a curious thing because I have no idea who you are in the audience or what interests you or what you know about or why you come or anything. So a conversation is a kind of two-way thing where you learn as you go, but here's me going blah 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 for 18 minutes but not quite knowing who you are. But I'll do my best and hope you find it interesting, and anyway we'll have some kind of dialogue afterwards. So the first thing I don't know is what your relationship to Buddhism might be. I imagine it's quite a mixture in the audience, you know, Buddhists and non-Buddhists. That's great. But the first thing I would say is I think it's a fantastic time to be a Buddhist, here and now in the West. And I certainly love it. I feel very blessed to be in this position at the moment. The specific reason is there's a huge meeting going on between the whole ancient tradition of Buddhism, 2,500 years old, and the whole Western world mindset culture, and specifically the kind of questioning, critical, rational, kind of scientific Western perspective. So basically the ancient Buddhist tradition is being kind of interrogated by the modern Western mind, and hopefully benefiting as a result. I think anything that gets old gets a little bit rusty. You know, barnacles creep up on you and it gets a bit set in its ways and so on and so on. So I hope that you know, Buddhism meeting the West will refresh Buddhism. Something purer and more essential will kind of re-emerge from this meeting. So I love being part of that meeting. The second thing I want to say is that I think this is a very sobering time to be a Buddhist, because I think it's pretty clear that the world, the environment, life is in jeopardy. Our theme this year is evolution or extinction, and it's just so much in the air: climate change, environmental catastrophe, species extinction, and so on and so on. And so we live in quite sobering times, and it's a sobering time to be a Buddhist, because our practice has to have some kind of answer to that. So what I'd like to do in the talk is take a little part of the Buddhist path and kind of, you know, almost play at interrogating it. You know, does it work in our modern times in this situation? So Anuttara, in her 18 minutes, managed to cover the whole path, right up to Nirvana. Fantastic. In fact, she got there after 9 minutes. Fabulous. I'm going to take one part of the Buddhist path, which is ethics. So when the Buddha was on his last days, his last tour before he died, he visited as many of his disciples as he could, and he summarized his teaching as simply as he could. And his summary was what we call today the threefold path, which consists of ethics, meditation, wisdom. Ethics, meditation, wisdom. So I want to talk a little bit about ethics, which is a highly practical part of the Buddhist path. It's how you live your life. And in this formulation, it's the beginning, how we live our lives. So you can talk about Buddhist ethics in many, many different ways, but probably the most common way, which many of us will be familiar with, is the 5 precepts. Which I think is common to the whole Buddhist world. I doubt if there's any Buddhist tradition that doesn't, honour the 5 precepts. What I'd like to do is go through them one by one and just sort of hold them up and shake them a bit and see if they, see what they've got to say or how they answer our present situation. But just a slightly more general comment to begin with is that the Buddha walked this earth 2,500 years ago, and it's not so long geologically, it's nothing, but the world was a very different place 2,500 years ago. Jai Raja gave a talk here yesterday, and he commented, and I assume this is true, that 2,500 years ago the population of planet Earth was 20 million. But today that's the population of one city out of a whole bunch of mega cities. And our global population is, I think it's 8 billion. So what a lot more people there are. In the Buddha's day, you read all the stories, basically India was a giant jungle, a huge jungle, covered in trees from, coast to coast. And humanity, civilization, was little tiny clearings in the jungle with paths between it. Quite fragile, the jungle was there, it's going to push in if you weren't careful. There were few people, wild animals roamed. So quite a lot of the similes in the Buddhist stories are kind of pro-cities, pro-roads, anti-jungle, anti-wild animals. Not quite anti-nature, but very different similes to ones we choose today. I'll give you an example. Nirvana is likened to a city, a great, fabulous city that's got lost in a jungle. The jungle's come and overgrown it. But this one person, this explorer, has managed to hack a path through the jungle, rediscovered a city that's always there, Nirvana, it's always been possible, opened up a path, more and more people can follow the path and make a nice road through the jungle. We can all go up and down the road to the city, which can get bigger and bigger, fuller and fuller of people. So that's, a great simile in the Buddha's time, but we wouldn't quite choose those images, would we? Let's make a road through the jungle. Okay, another one is developing a mind that can just, a mind of equanimity, a mind that can absorb any I don't want to use a rude word, but anything you can throw at it, your mind can absorb it with equanimity. And this is the simile, just like the earth, you can throw anything you like at the earth and it will absorb it won't mind. Again, we wouldn't use that simile about the earth these days. We know the earth is more fragile. So anyway, that's an example of times change. So the 5 precepts, I'm going to take them in reverse order for reasons that might become obvious. So each precept has 2 halves to it. I'm probably preaching to the converted for half of us. The 5th precept says, first of all, avoid intoxicants and practice mindfulness. Less intoxicants, more mindfulness. What I'd like to comment on is I think there's many descriptions of mindfulness in the Buddhist sutras. And mindfulness is great. Mindfulness is big these days. But I think the classic descriptions of mindfulness miss out a very important dimension that we need today. The classic descriptions of mindfulness are about being fully present in our senses. Here we are experiencing in the present moment. And also a sense of purpose. This is our purpose, a mindfulness of purpose. But they miss out something very important, which I hope I can illustrate. So I went shopping before I came here to Morrison's, and I bought 2 apples. So here we are, 2 apples, and we could be mindful of the apples. They've got colour, smell, taste, touch, all that. But all that mindfulness wouldn't tell us something really important about these 2 apples. So the fact is, this apple is a Bramley, comes from England, and this apple comes from New Zealand, which is a completely different journey this apple has taken. It's been grown and travelled 12,000 miles to get here. So basically the impact of buying this apple is completely different to the impact of buying this apple. So if you buy this apple, you're kind of participating in demand for more of this, more 12,000 mile journeys around the planet of this. But you're not with this. So that's a mindfulness of the footprints, of the background, of the kind of chain of events that have led to this thing. And you can't perceive it with your senses. It's a mindfulness or an awareness that's more comes through learning. Learning, how was this made? Where's this come from? And so on. But I think today, that kind of mindfulness of the footprint of things is crucial. So I think that needs to come into our 5 precepts. Okay, this is very brief. So the 4th precept is about speech. For Buddhism, speech is incredibly important. It's almost the primary way we affect the world, our speech. And the precept is to avoid untruthful speech and to speak truthful speech, which is great. But what I want to say is that quite likely, if you think of the classic Buddhist practitioner, it might be quite a private activity. You think of the monk in the monastery, the ascetic in the cave, the meditator in the forest. It's quite a private, personal activity. And there's no kind of obligation on the practitioner to sort of shout about what they're doing, to kind of go preaching, if you like. But I think these days the environmental issues that we face are completely collective. It's like the entire planet will go forwards healthily or not. So I think our spiritual practice can't be a private matter because we're part of a public, a worldwide situation. So I think we have to kind of introduce into our speech something about speaking more publicly, standing up for what we believe in. Not quite preaching, that wouldn't be right, but letting people know this is where we stand, being out and proud. And if you just practice and keep yourself to yourself, you're not going to have much positive impact on the world. So that's a tricky thing to negotiate because nobody wants to be preached at, but you want to be, out and proud. And speech is a very powerful way to do that. So the third precept, I'm going through quite rapidly, is avoiding sexual misconduct, and then the positive form is practicing stillness, simplicity and contentment. That's how we put it. So what I'd like to comment on is we clearly need, as a society, more stillness, simplicity and contentment. And, to just build that into our lifestyles much more. That's great. But I think what we especially need to do is just make that practice really attractive and beautiful and compelling. Buddhism has got a slight strain of asceticism in it. Let's give this up. Let's go forth. Let's be a renunciate. Let's, practice self-discipline and so on. But I think we have to make it really attractive and beautiful and enticing, our practice of stillness, simplicity and contentment. So that we radiate it, so that people want to join us in it, so that it becomes more attractive than endless consumerism and shopping and whatever else. So again, it has to be a kind of thing we live in public, rather than a thing we practice in private. We have to kind of demonstrate, if you like, this is the way to be. Again, that might not be comfortable for some people, but the fact is we're part of a public situation, and we can't just be a private, separate from that. We can discuss all this. You might be strongly disagreeing with me. That'd be really interesting. So the second precept, is on the negative side, it's always formulated in a slightly particular way. It's not taking the not given, but practicing instead generosity. Not taking the not given, practicing generosity. So not taking the not given is slightly more specific than not stealing. It's like if it's not given to you, you shouldn't take it. If it is given to you, that's great. And I think with this, what it kind of doesn't quite look at is the fact that we live in an incredibly throw-away society. Endless things we produce and throw away almost immediately. Food, packaging, resources, TV sets, everything. If you go to the dump, household recycling centre, whatever it's called, in your neighbourhood, you see skips full of extraordinary things which are just perfectly usable, and there they are. And to my mind, it's almost unethical not to use something that's been thrown away, but it's perfectly good and you could use it. It's a different take on this precept. If it is there and you could use it and it's been dumped, it's got no owner, no one's ever going to give it to you because there's no owner to give it to you. But it should be used. Rather than buying a new one at the shops, use one that you can. So I think we do live in a throwaway society, and the more we can reuse stuff, the better. It's kind of recycling or upcycling in action. So that's tricky, because you can't always tell what's been thrown away and what's been temporarily put down and somebody's coming back later. And this festival is a good example. If you find anything put down here, the person probably would like it back. But I think you do often see stuff in society that has just been dumped. It really has. So I'm all in favour of, whatever you call it, skipping, and recycling. So the first precept I left to last because I think it's almost the most tricky to talk about. The precept is avoiding violence and practicing instead deeds of loving kindness. So violence, as it's traditionally spoken about, is fairly obvious and crude things, like killing people, hitting people, physical violence. And obviously that's not good. However, we can discuss it later. However, I think we live our lives embedded in structures, social and economic structures, and some of those structures, quite frankly, have violence embedded in them. There's a term for it, which is structural violence. So if the system we're part of just has inequality embedded in it, that's violence embedded in it. We might be, very likely we are, on the right side of that, the happy side of that, but there's violence embedded in it. And I think that's a whole type of violence we need to recognise as being violent and withdraw from and address. And again, it won't be the kind of violence you can perceive immediately, because there's nobody visible with your senses hitting anybody. But it's going to be embedded in the social and economic realities we're part of. So, every so often you read in the papers about clothing factories producing fashionable clothing with slave labour. That's violence. There's no other word for it. Or, fruit pickers picking raspberries or whatever, but with effectively slave labour, and so on and so on. Again, it demands a kind of awareness that needs learning to learn, and then different choices. So some people don't like this because it makes everything more complicated. You can't just go shopping and buy an apple. You've got to learn the whole history of the apple. But in a sense, you only need to learn it once, and then you kind of know what to do next. Go to a different shop, buy a different brand, whatever. But I think we need to recognise a big type of violence is structural violence. And I'm not aware of the Buddha talking about it. Maybe he did, but I'm not aware of it. I think in the Buddha's day, everything was simpler and more immediate, more to hand. So that's the 5 precepts. With a very kind of brief pick up and shake of each precept, I would just recommend doing this with any Buddhist teaching you hear about. Pick it up and shake it. Kind of interrogate it with the best of the Western critical, scientific, rational mind. And I totally trust that in that process, the kind of purity of the original teaching will emerge. I think the kind of deep principles of Buddhism are perfect. I've got no criticism whatsoever. But we just need to re-ask ourselves how to practice them, here and now. Yes. So that's all I want to say, really. I think another thing I feel blessed with is being part of what's basically a new Buddhist movement. I mean, this is Triratna. We're 50 years old. I think it was last year. It's nothing, 50 years. But I think it's easier for us to kind of pick up the old teachings and shake them than it would be for an order, a tradition that's 1,000 years old, which is probably more kind of wedded to that way of doing things. So I feel blessed to be part of, in a way, something with not that long history.